Let's open up our Bibles to John chapter 18, verse 37. John chapter 18, verse 37. Let's read all together. Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." You're surprised, right? Today's topic is 1 Kings, but you are probably surprised that our opening passage is John. If we were to express the theme of the Kings in one phrase, I would personally say it is John chapter 18, verse 37, when it says, "I am a king." The reason is that the purpose for recording the book of the Kings was to show that no king on this earth, nor any prophet in this earth, can solve the problems of humanity on this earth. As we study the Kings, we see that even the wise King Solomon fell into corruption in the end. Asa, the first reformer king of Judah, he started off good, but even he also ends with a perverted faith. In 1 Kings, there are 4 kings from Judah and 8 from Israel who are recorded, plus Solomon's 40-year reign, which makes it a total of 13 kings in 1 Kings. Surprisingly, all of these kings end their lives in disappointment. Through these 13 kings, as we read about them, we realize that there is no king on this earth who will ever meet our expectations. We realize that there's no king who truly loves the people. We realize that there's no king on this earth who leads the people properly towards God. This is what we're able to understand. As we read through the Kings, we come to feel the need for a true king who loves the people and leads them rightly to God. That's what we're able to feel. And today, while studying 1 Kings, please remember John chapter 18, verse 37. I am a king. Please remember this. You'll see why Jesus had to come to this earth through the failures of the kings in 1 Kings. Only Jesus is truly my king. Only Jesus truly loves me as king. Only Jesus is the king who can safely lead me to heaven. Only Jesus is the king who can truly help me understand the truth. Only Jesus is the king who can truly make me happy. As we learn through the 13 kings and 1 Kings, we should come to feel this, that Jesus is my king. Only Jesus is the true king. In the Korean Bible, the title of 1 Kings is the record of the kings. But in the original Hebrew, it is simply kings. However, in the Septuagint, the book titled Kings was renamed the Record of Many Kings, which in the Korean Revised Version is now called the Record of the Kings. The name of the book changed to be the Record of Many Kings. As I mentioned, 1 Kings includes 13 kings, including Solomon. That's why it's called First Kings. But when we look at the lives of these 13 kings, in our eyes, it's disappointing. And it shows us the need for a true king. Let's look at page 3 of the outline. When we read the books of history in the Bible, there is a lesson for us. What is this lesson? Those who do not learn from history are bound to repeat its unfortunate events. That is why God recorded so many books of history in the Bible. There are 17 books of history in the Old Testament and 5 in the New Testament. So in total, there are about 22 books in the Bible that are books of history. Why did God record so much history? So that we do not repeat the same tragic history. Simply put, don't fail like these foolish kings. Don't fall. Don't follow their path. Don't go the way of King Jeroboam. Go the way of King David. This is the lesson that 1 Kings gives us. Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12. 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 12. Let's read together. And when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us when the Lord your God was your king. In a way, it was because of this wrong request from the Israelites that they had to suffer many painful days. God was Israel's king. But when the Israelites saw the institutions of the surrounding nations, the Gentiles, right? Those Gentile nations had kings. They thought it would be good for us to have a visible king too. Someone who seems strong and someone who seems assuring. They envied the Gentile systems and demanded a king from God. Even though God was already their king, they asked for another king. But God, though aware of their ignorance and selfishness, He granted their request. He granted their request. And He warned them. They will exploit you. They will oppress you. The kings will. Still, they insisted, saying, that's fine, give us a king. So they had many kings. Judah, southern Judah, had about 20 kings, of which around 8 were good. But most were evil. Northern Israel had 19 kings, and most of them were evil. They were all evil. The Israelites suffered because of these wicked kings. They were exploited and suffered. What lesson does this teach us? That we must serve God alone as our king. If you follow another king who is not God, if you serve a king who is not God, at first, it may seem like the king is for you, like the king will help you. But in the end, he will take away your peace, steal your joy, and cause you suffering. Even though it's a bit uncomfortable to talk about, haven't we experienced the same in our own country? We thought if that person becomes president, or that person becomes president, or that person becomes president, we thought that they would lead to change. And we elected them as our president. And yet, we continue to experience the same disappointment, the same pain again and again. Everyone, that's just how it is. It can't be helped. It can't be helped. Because there's no perfect nation on this earth. No one on this earth loves their people 100%, rules with the truth 100%, or leads the people to God as the king. It's not only the book of the Kings that teach us this, but we learn it through our own experience. Truly, the only one we must serve as king is Jesus Christ. There's no one else. He never disappoints us. He truly loves us to the point of death. If you look at page 3 at the very last paragraph, it says, the book of Kings teaches us that Israel's downfall was the result of disobedience by both the kings and the people. In Deuteronomy, there is a covenant that says if you obey, you will be blessed, and if you disobey, you will be cursed. And in the Kings, it presents the fulfillment of that covenant. When they obeyed, what happened during Solomon's time? They experienced an unprecedented golden age of civilization, including the building of the temple. But when they disobeyed, they were utterly forsaken, and the nation was torn into two, into southern Judah and northern Israel. And furthermore, another lesson we gain from 1 Kings is that through the stories of the lives of the kings, God continually reminds us of his covenant. In 1st and 2nd Kings, northern Israel goes through 8 changes in dynasty. But in southern Judah, even while northern Israel changed dynasties 8 times, in southern Judah, the kings always came from the house of David. Why is that? Was it because the kings of Judah were especially good? Was it because they were all good? No. There's only one reason. The only reason is the covenant that God made with David. God had promised David. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 9. 1 Kings chapter 9. Verses 4 to 5. Now, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and in uprightness, to do according to all that I have commanded you, and if you keep my statutes and my judgments, let's read verse 5 together. Then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, as I promised David your father, saying, you shall not fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. The covenant given to David is also given to Solomon. Therefore, David became the standard of a good king. Therefore, what do we see repeatedly written? He was not like his father David. He did not walk the way of David. We are continually reminded of the covenant of God and David. Let's also look at chapter 11, 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 35 to verse 36. But I will take the kingdom out of his son's hand and give it to you, 10 tribes. And to his son I will give 1 tribe, that my servant David may always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself, to put my name there. These were words spoken to Jeroboam. God said that he would take 10 tribes away from Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and give them to Jeroboam. But he would leave 1 tribe with Rehoboam because of his covenant with David. As I mentioned earlier, northern Israel went through 8 changes in dynasty. For example, the Kim dynasty was replaced by the Lee dynasty, then the Lee dynasty by the Suk dynasty. This is a kind of complete dynastic shifts that happened 8 times in total. But southern Judah, from beginning to end, every kingdom was a descendant of David. Why is it that Southern Judah didn't experience changes in dynasty even though it had evil and corrupt kings. Solomon himself had 1,000 wives and openly practiced idolatry. But why didn't the dynasty change? It was because of the covenant with David. That's what the books of the kings are teaching us. God always keeps his covenant. Humans may forget God's promises, but God never forgets. He always keeps and fulfills them. That's what the books of the kings are telling us. The problem lies with us. God never changes, but we do. God's promises are always the same, but we are the ones who change. That's why sometimes God feels distant, and sometimes he feels near. Sometimes he feels terrifying, and other times he feels full of love. But the truth is, God is always the same, unchanging, and right beside us. It's we who keep changing. And there's another lesson that the books of history teach us. The rise and fall of Israel was directly tied to their obedience to God. When they obeyed, they prospered. When they disobeyed, disaster came. In that sense, the beginning and end of the books of the kings are teaching us this very truth. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1. Now, King David was old, advanced in years. So, the king that appears in the first chapter of the first verse of 1 Kings is not the first king of Israel, Saul, but rather 1 Kings begins with David. Why does God begin 1 Kings with David and not Saul? It is because David is the king who was the standard. He is the model by which the kings of Israel are judged throughout the book of Kings. There is a particular expression that God used only for David. A man after God's own heart. This phrase was applied solely to David. And it shows that this is the kind of king God desires. David was a man after God's own heart. And so God says that except for a sin with Bathsheba, he acted uprightly. Why did God record David's sin with Bathsheba? It's to show that there is no perfect king on this earth. Even though David was aligned with God's heart and was chosen as the earthly standard for kingship, he was still a flawed king. He sinned with Bathsheba. But Jesus, who is my king, he is the perfect king. He is a king without blemish. As good as a model David may have been, we still need Jesus Christ. Why? Because even David was a king with flaws. Nonetheless, aside from the incident with Bathsheba, David acted uprightly before God and was the king who conquered the largest territory. But now, look at the end of 1 Kings. 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 51. Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel and Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 2 years over Israel. Ahaziah was the 8th king of northern Israel. Verse 52, he did evil in the sight of the Lord and walked in the way of his father and in the way of his mother and in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin. In short, Ahaziah followed only the worst examples of the kings. King Ahab, his mother, Jezebel, and Jeroboam, the first king of northern Israel. Jeroboam was the standard or sample of the wicked kings. So when we read Kings, we often see the phrase walked in the way of Jeroboam, used for evil kings. Most of the wicked kings are described to have walked in the way of Jeroboam. Ahaziah, in particular, resembled all the infamous figures of northern Israel's wickedness, Jeroboam, Ahab, and Jezebel. And Let's look at verse 53. For he served Baal and worshipped him and provoked the Lord God of Israel to anger according to all that his father had done. First Kings ends like this. Starts with David, but it ends with Ahaziah's disobedience and disaster. When Israel obeyed, it prospered. But when it disobeyed, it fell. The same rule applies to us. When we obey God, we are prosperous, but when we disobey God, it surely leads to ruin. And then division begins. The nation was split. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11. Disobedience led to division from God and division within the nation. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 9. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant with my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. It's easy to remember, right? 1 Kings 11 verse 11 says that God foretold that Israel will be torn in two. This came as a result of Solomon's disobedience. Verse 9, his heart turned from the Lord. What turned Solomon's heart? Verse 3 tells us, foreign women. These foreign women were attractive, even dazzling. While some of these marriages were for political alliances, no doubt he was drawn by their beauty. What happens when we fix our eyes on worldly things? Our hearts gradually turn away from God. The heart is the first to drift. And once our heart turns away, our lives will follow. And when our hearts turn from God, what do we end up seeing? Idols. Anything we fix our eyes on apart from God becomes an idol. And if you fall into idolatry, what happens? Division happens. Marriages divide. Brothers and sisters divide. Even parent-child relationships divide. So do our relationships in the workplace. This is God's lesson for us. He said, I will surely tear away from you and give it to your servant. Right? He took away joy and gave it to another. God also took away grace and glory and gave it to someone else. He takes away service and entrusts it to other brothers and sisters. God does. God takes and gives to someone else. He took the kingdom from Saul and gave it to David. Right? Likewise, the apostleship of Judas was taken and given to Matthias. God gives to others. We lose joy. We lose boldness when our hearts turn away from Him. That is the consequence of disobedience. There's division. Your heart becomes divided. You don't feel like reading the Word. And honestly, meeting with brothers and sisters feels burdensome. You just want to be alone. Even the pastor's sermons, somehow they feel like they're being aimed at you, rebuking you. It feels too harsh, too burdensome. And it makes you stop listening to sermons altogether because it strikes your heart. And that's how one begins to fall apart little by little. And yet you don't even realize it's happening. You slowly drift into darkness, sinking into the worst kind of pit, and yet you don't notice it yourself. But here's the amazing thing. There's hope. Yes, there's hope. The books of the kings are records of many kings. But interwoven through those records are the stories of people who are not kings. These were the prophets, the stories of the prophets. In 1 Kings 13, a prophet from southern Judah appears and prophesies that the altar at Bethel will be torn down. A prophet from southern Judah appears. Then in chapter 17, the famous prophet Elijah appears. though the book of Kings is a record of the kings, prophets appear suddenly throughout, like in chapter 13, and then Elijah appears in chapter 17, 18, and 19, and finally in chapter 22, the prophet Micaiah is introduced. Elijah, in particular, was sent during the reign of Ahab, the most wicked king of all. So, at the darkest, the most hopeless and gloomy time for the people of Israel, God sent a great prophet, Elijah. This is love. This is love. Love. This shows that God never gives up. He will never abandon his beloved people. In the darkest times, he sent the brightest light. Not only that, but if we look closely at the book of Kings, we see how the fate of the king is tied to the fate of the people. It was the king who committed idolatry, but the people suffered too. Right? When King Ahab worshipped Baal, there was no rain for 3 years. How much did the people suffer? What does this tell us? That the destiny of a king is bound to that of his nation. Our destiny is bound to our King Jesus. If our future were tied to a king like Ahab, how uneasy would you be? You'd be doomed, wouldn't you? If our destiny were tied to a king like Ahab, we would suffer 100%. That'd be misery. Imagine if our fate were tied to someone like Kim Jong-un. Just the thought of it makes you feel bad. You might think, what kind of example is that? You don't even like it as an example. However, our destiny is tied to Jesus. That's why we're safe. Our destiny is tied to Jesus. How reassuring is that? He is my king. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4. Those who were connected to King David were all blessed. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4, it says, "For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David." If his heart had been like David's heart, he would have been blessed. But because his heart was not like that of King David, the kingdom was split in two during the reign of his son Rehoboam. If he had resembled David, if he had carried David's heart, if he had walked in David's ways, then Solomon would have been blessed, and so would the people. Let's get verse 33. Chapter 11, verse 33. "Because they have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the people of Ammon." Let's read the rest together. "And have not walked in my ways to do what is right in my eyes, and keep my statutes and my judgments, as did his father David." If they had walked in David's way, if they had done as David did, they would have been blessed. In chapter 15, verse 3, it says, "Abijam's heart was not like David's heart." And in chapter 15, verse 11, it says, "Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David." King Asa was blessed, at least in the beginning. But the people connected with King Jeroboam all suffered. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 15. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 25. 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 25. Let's read together. "Now Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa, king of Judah. And he reigned over Israel 2 years. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin by which he made Israel sin." Nadab was the 2nd king of northern Israel. Now, when you read the book of Kings, you'll notice that there are many kings mentioned. So it can get confusing. You might not know who is who or which number king they were. For example, when Rehoboam appears, I write down like this: the first king of southern Judah. When Jeroboam appears, I write first king of northern Israel. Nadab was the second king of northern Israel. His father was Jeroboam. Who was the second king of southern Judah? That was Abijah. And the third, who was it? It was King Asa. Not Asa, but Asa. It's easy to remember King Asa. King Asa was the first reformer king. I personally find it helpful to label each king's name with a J or an I in front of their name to identify whether they were from Judah or Israel, and also to mark which number they were. It's very simple. I found that system very easy to follow. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 15, verse 26, it says, Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, walked in the exact same way as his father Jeroboam. And what was the result? As stated at the end of verse 26, he caused the people of Israel to walk in the same sinful path. If you look here, we can see that the people follow in the footsteps of their kings. In most cases, if the king walked in the path of goodness, so did the people. If the king walked the path of evil, the people astonishingly followed along. Their destiny was the same. And that's why they received the same disasters. So you can see, meeting a truly good king is a blessing for the people. And for us, what a great blessing it is that we have met the truly good King Jesus. We follow him all the way to heaven. Our Lord, who is our King, fills our lives with good things. There's another lesson we can gain from the book of the Kings. The construction of the temple finally appears in 1 Kings. The building of the temple is recorded across 4 chapters. Chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, and chapter 8. 4 chapters detail the preparation for building the temple, the completion of the temple, the crafting of the temple furnishings, and the dedication ceremony. Across these 4 chapters, they finally built the temple that they longed for. But ironically, in chapter 11, after building the temple, Solomon is corrupted. After longing so much to build the temple, after constructing the very place where God's presence would dwell, he's corrupted. This makes us think very deeply. A temple is just a temple. The temple itself does not protect Israel. It's not about saying, I did this, or I built a temple. What matters is the heart with which we are serving God now. That's how we must live out our faith. Oh, I used to be a teacher, or I used to be a young adult officer. I'm not asking you about what you used to be. I'm asking you about now. What matters is the heart with which you are serving the Lord right now. What good is it to have built a temple if you are walking away from God now? What good is it to have served zealously in the past if now you do not obey or worship the Lord? That is not what matters. Failed Christians live off memories of the past. But healthy Christians obey God now. Remember that Solomon, who built the temple, fell into idolatry. The things we have done mean nothing. Please remember that. Doesn't matter who you evangelized, what service you did, or how you lived. That's not important. You can fall. You can stumble. That's not what defines your faith. It's all grace. It was all grace. Even if many were saved through my evangelism, it wasn't because of me. Don't become proud because of that, and don't fall into delusion that your faith is greater than others. Being a deacon, that's not what defines your faith. The real question is whether you are living that out. The word deacon itself means one who takes hold of work. A true servant of the Lord steps forward, sacrificing and dedicating themselves. Being a former mother's group leader or father's group leader, those things aren't what matters. What matters is, what am I holding on to now? Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 27. First Kings chapter 8, verse 27. Let's read together. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built? Solomon understood this. Would God truly dwell in the temple I have built? Even the heavens cannot contain him. So how could this house, this temple I have made, hold him? Let's apply this to ourselves. No matter what I've done, no matter how I lived, no matter how much I've sacrificed or dedicated in the past, can we really say God is present in that alone? He must be in me now. The Lord must be in me now. The Lord must be at work in me now. And we must live with a heart that allows him to walk with us today. That's why he said, you are the temple. We are the temple. We must live so that the Lord may dwell within us. Don't live off memories of the past. Oh, back then I was like that. Those were the good old days. That's how it used to be. Don't live your Christian life that way. We must live so that the Lord may dwell within us now. That's how we must live. Let's turn to page 18. Page 18 of the outline. Starting in chapter 6, the process of building the temple is recorded in detail. Look at the bottom of page 18. The temple was the place of God's presence. The very word temple means a holy separated place. It was the place God separated to meet with the people of Israel. He spoke there. In the past, he spoke from the tabernacle. Then, after Solomon built the temple, God's presence filled the sanctuary. The temple is where God dwells. It is where we meet God, where we receive his word. So look, God opened a way for filthy sinners to meet the holy God. He created a way for unclean sinners to come before the holy God. This was the temple. If there had been no temple, how could sinners have met God? Without the temple, without the tabernacle, how could filthy sinners approach the holy God? It was by bringing a lamb into the tabernacle, into the temple, where they could meet with the Lord and come before him. And this temple is Jesus Christ. Today, it is through Jesus, who has become the temple, that we can enter the holy kingdom of God and meet him. The temple teaches us this truth. Let's turn to John chapter 2, verse 21. John chapter 2, verse 21. Let's read together. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. That famous line, destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. And what did the Jews say? It took 46 years to build this temple. And you will raise it up in 3 days? But Jesus was speaking of the fact that he would die and rise again on the third day. Therefore, if you don't truly understand the meaning and will of Jesus' words, you'll interpret them completely wrong. We can make the same mistake. Even when we listen to a sermon on the Kings today, if we don't understand God's intent, we can misinterpret as we listen. We end up misunderstanding and misapplying the word. Jesus' body was the temple. What does this mean? It means that today we meet God through Jesus and come to the Father through him. That's why in John chapter 14, verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Saying, I am the teacher. And saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, as it says in John chapter 14, verse 6, means the same thing. It means the same thing. Now, our bodies are also temples. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16, it says, do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells within you? We are the temple. What does this mean? It means that Gentiles should now be able to meet God through us. We must lead them to God to the foot of the cross. Through us, they should be able to see God. So this is what it means to believe in God. This is what saving faith looks like. This is what a Christian life looks like. A saved person lives this way at work and in their family. This is how a saved person uses their money. This is how they use their time. We are the temple. The temple in the past was where people met God, heard his word, and came before him. If we are the temple, then the people in this world must be able to know God through us and meet Jesus Christ through us. And that temple is still being built today. Let's look at Ephesians chapter 2, verse 20 to 22. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 20 to 22. Having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. Let's read verse 22 together. In whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. The intangible temple of God, the intangible church, the intangible body of the Lord is being built even now. The temple is where God dwells. It is his dwelling place. That's the church. When the last person known only to God is saved, then the Lord's body, the temple, will be complete. Once the dwelling place of the Lord is fully completed, then this world's history will no longer be necessary. Solomon's temple was built in 7 years. But today, the body of Christ, the church, the intangible temple of the Lord, has been under construction for 2,000 years. This is the reason God continues to guide the history of the world. This is a time in which he is completing the church, the temple, the bride that is the recipient of his love. Once the church is complete, once the temple is complete, our history will no longer be needed. How precious must the church be that God has been building it for 2,000 years? Think about it. Solomon's temple took only 7 years to build. Yet the Lord has been building his temple for 2,000 years. If there's anything God considers most precious in all the universe, it is the church. The church. How do you treat the church? Is the church to you as well the most precious thing in the universe? The church is not something you treat lightly. The church is not a place where you come and go as you please. It's not a place where you live out your personality or your preferences. There are those who say, oh, I think this way. I feel like I'm being two-faced because you're making me do it this way, so I'll just do it my own way. I serve when I want to and not when I don't want to. But that's frightening. The Lord never treated the church that way. What does the church mean to me? This temple was almost 2 times the size of the tabernacle made by Moses. Solomon's temple was about exactly twice the size of the tabernacle Moses built. However, compared to the glory of God, we can't say that it was that big. No structure in this world can fully contain the glory of God. It cannot fill his glory. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 7. Let's read together. And the temple, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the temple while it was being built. You understand what this means, right? They shaped and finished the stones completely at the quarrying site. Then they brought it to the temple where they did no further cutting, just assembly. So inside the temple, no tools were heard. No iron tool made a sound. So this also gives us a very good lesson, an important one. In the sanctuary where God is worshipped, in the temple where we meet God, there must be no sound of iron tools. There must be no human noise. There must be no loud noises or sounds of fighting. There must be no sounds of conflict or strange sounds. There must be no sounds of dispute. If you hear sounds of dispute, will that bring glory to God? Can God work in the midst of that? That is not the type of temple God desires. That is not the kind of church God wants. That is not the appearance of the body of Christ. There must be no sound of conflict, fighting, quarreling, dispute, discomfort, or complaint. Why? Because it is the body of the Lord. Now turning to page 6 of the outline. Page 6 of the outline. I said that Solomon built the temple, but fell into idolatry. He built the temple, but was not able to establish his own faith. He built the temple, but was not able to establish his own faith. He built a temple, but his faith crumbled. What meaning is there if you build the temple, but you fall? What meaning is there if I do great things for God, but in the end, I stumble? You have to build both, the temple and your faith. Don't let go of either. Being used by God and doing His work is important, but don't neglect personal meditation. Serving well is good, but don't neglect the time on your knees. Singing praise is wonderful, but do not neglect the time spent face to face with God in His Word. You must do both well, but we are gradually falling apart because we say, I already served. I already went on visitation. I stayed up late doing the Lord's work because we're tired. We pray half-heartedly and we don't read the Bible. This is the start of falling. Let us not follow the example of Solomon, who built the temple but failed to establish his own faith. Your end must be good. We must be good until the end. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32, we know that Hebrews 11 is known as the chapter of faith. It lists over 30 names of those of great faith. And if you look at verse 32, it mentions Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel. If you look at verse 32, by our standards, it seems like Samson should be left out, but Samson is included. And by our standards, it seems like Solomon should be included, but Solomon is left out. Samson is there, but Solomon is not. Why is that? Solomon did not end well. As for Samson, though his eyes were gouged out, he repented and turned back at the end. And it says that he killed more Philistines in his death than he had during his life. He thoroughly turned back. The point is that we must be good in the end. That means today must be good. Why? Because today could be the end for me. Today must be right. Because today could be the end. Then, God will accept you as a person of faith. Even if you failed yesterday, even if you fell yesterday, even if you were ashamed yesterday, what matters is that today is right, that you are established today. Then God will see you as a person of faith. What I have done is not what matters. What matters is keeping your faith humbly until the end. It doesn't matter if you built the temple. It doesn't matter if you held a ministry or service. That's not what's important. Let it all go. Just like in the beginning, always stay humble. Like when you were first saved, like when you were first called. Wouldn't our church become more beautiful if we lived that way? Wouldn't our Lord be pleased? Let's look at page 6. Page 6. The key point of this academy is to grasp the flow and the structure. What I always emphasize the most is the division of the content by chapter and the themes of each chapter. This is very important. By understanding this, you can grasp the framework of 1 Kings. Once you have the framework firmly in place, the detail, interior work is something you can take care of at your own home. For example, what is chapter 1 talking about? Or what is chapter 2 talking about? The important thing is why God gave us the book of 1 Kings. As I mentioned earlier, is to show us that there's no true king in this world. It reveals the necessity of the true King, Jesus Christ, in this world. If you understand just that one point, you get a perfect score, 100%. To prove this truth, 22 chapters of history were written. So what kind of history is it? It is divided into 2 categories. Chapters 1 to 11 cover Solomon's 40-year reign. Because of Solomon, the kingdom eventually split into 2. When? In chapter 12. It's easy to remember, right? 10 and 2. The division happened in chapter 12 in 930 BC. I remember it like this. We have small group for church school at 9:30 in the morning. That's how I memorized it. So in chapter 12, Rehoboam appears. During Solomon's reign, the kingdom was not divided, but the Lord said that it would be divided during his son's time. That's why Solomon's son Rehoboam appears in chapter 12, and his failures in governance are described there. Now, if you look from chapter 1, in chapter 1, it begins with Adonijah's rebellion. The first event in 1 Kings is rebellion. 1 Kings begins with rebellion. This is mankind. It shows the true nature of man. Humanity is always in rebellion, always rebelling against God, always rebelling against the faith, always turning away. Why do people rebel? To become king. Because of power, success, ambition, and the desire to do what they want. They turn their backs on God. This is rebellion. This is mankind. And that is why we need the true King, Jesus Christ. Then, in chapter 2, David gives his last words and dies. David's last words are important. Why are they important? Because they are words directed towards us. And what about David? He poured his entire life's experience into his final words. This was David's essence. That's why it was very important. He spoke of the virtues and attitudes necessary to lead the people properly. That's what we see in chapter 2. Then in chapter 3, Solomon, having heard these last words, asked God for wisdom. The famous judgment of Solomon appears in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, we see the blessings that came as a result of that wisdom. The chapter shows how greatly Israel prospered. So up to this point, the picture is very beautiful. Then in chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, Solomon builds the long-desired temple. He received wisdom, enjoyed prosperity, and with that wealth, he builds the temple. This is the flow that you observe. Then, in chapter 10, we reach the climax. The queen of Sheba hears of Solomon's wisdom and comes to visit. And it says that there was no more spirit in her. She was in complete awe. Chapter 10, records this as an example showing the pinnacle of God's blessing upon Solomon. But immediately following that peak, chapter 11 tells us of his corruption. Failure comes after success. Be careful when things are going well. Remain humble. That's the unchanging principle. This is the flow from chapter 1 to chapter 11. Now let's look at page 7. Page 7. We see Adonijah's rebellion in chapter 1. Why did Adonijah rebel? He had his reasons. He was first in line for the throne. David's first son was Amnon, but he raped his half-sister Tamar and was killed by Absalom. The second was Gilead, but he died early from illness. The third was Absalom, but he was killed by Joab. Then the fourth was Adonijah. With all his older brothers gone, he was first in line for the throne. But the kingship was passed to Solomon. Adonijah must have heard rumors of this, so he made the first move. Adonijah was not only the heir to the throne, but it also says he was very good looking. Even in appearance, Adonijah looked like a king. So what happened? People around him, probably the disloyal servants, must have stirred him up saying, "Oh, the prince should be king." They were judging him by his looks and his rank. And as a result, Adonijah couldn't control his heart. And he ended up rebelling. But when did he rebel? When David had grown old. This shows that Adonijah calculated thoroughly and had prepared carefully. And who were the people he gathered to his side? Those who felt disappointed by David. They were people who had vowed to David, and yet he turned them into his own allies, such as Joab and Abiathar. He conspired with them. He joined forces with those people. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." How arrogant is this? People like this are rare. He exalted himself, saying, "I will be king." He exalted himself. Look here. Do you see any mention of God here? How arrogant is that? You can feel that there's no fear of God in this man. Right? Just look at this expression here. And in verse 5, it says he prepared chariots and horsemen for himself and 50 men to run before him. What does this mean? God's will is nowhere to be found. God's will was for Solomon to be king, wasn't it? It says for himself. God's will is nowhere to be found. And it's all about doing what he wants. Pride is overestimating oneself and looking down on others. Pride. He probably thought to himself that he was better than Solomon. He thought he was better looking. He thought, "Oh, look at Solomon. He's just a bookworm. All he does is read. He doesn't know politics. But me, I have a sense of politics and I have leadership." But that's pride. To think, I know I'm fit for this position is pride. Why is Solomon the king? That resentment, that is pride. I should be the one serving there. I should be the one with that possession. That ministry suits me better. Why is that brother or sister in that place? That's pride. Adonijah planned everything thoroughly in verse 5. It said he prepared for himself 50 men to run before him. He planned the rebellion with precision. Then in verse 7, he even recruited the priest Abiathar. Why? Because as the prospective king of the new regime, he needed to be seen as legitimate. So he brought in the priest, and he also recruited Joab, the chief military leader, the right-hand man of David himself. Then, in verses 9 to 10, we can see that this was no ordinary person. Verse 9, and Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fatted cattle by the stone of Zoeleth, which is by En Rogel. He also invited all his brothers, the king's sons, and all the men of Judah, the king's servants. Verse 10, but he did not invite Nathan, the prophet, Benaiah, the mighty men, or Solomon, his brother. There is a list of those he invited and those he didn't. He invited his allies, but he did not invite his political rivals. This shows how carefully and thoroughly he planned and prepared. But there is one thing Adonijah overlooked. No matter how meticulously he planned and prepared, becoming king or not is whose authority? It is God's authority. You must understand that. We can fall into the same thing. From our perspective, someone might seem like the perfect fit, or we might think that we ourselves are the perfect fit, but never forget that the authority belongs to God. Let's look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 21 on page 8. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. It is God who removes and establishes kings. Daniel chapter 4, verse 17 also says, give it to whomever he will and sets over it the lowest of men. God appoints and removes kings according to his will. Adonijah planned meticulously. But he forgot that the foundation of ruling authority belongs to God. Just because I want it doesn't mean I'll get it. The Lord's work is not something we do just because we want to. It is God who appoints and God who removes. We just need to simply believe that everything within the church operates that way even now. Serve the Lord with that type of faith. Believe that it is God who appoints and God who moves. We must believe this. And that's why we obey that order. It's not because someone has leadership skills or because they are more capable or smarter than us that we cooperate with and obey them. It's because we believe that God has appointed them and that God is with them. Sometimes they may be younger than us, less educated, or less capable. But within God's order, we support, love, and work with them to exalt God's glory. That is the church. It is different from the world. The world looks at credentials. The world looks at those who are more capable, who graduated from a better school, or what kind of family background someone has. But God is not like that. The church is not like that. It is God who appoints, and it is God who removes. The issue with Adonijah, in fact, traces back to David's failure in parenting. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 1. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 6. And his father had not rebuked him at any time by saying, why have you done so? He was also very good looking. His mother had borne him after Absalom. Sometimes people say, oh, my father never once raised a rod against me. That kind of statement speaks to me in many ways. If you think this person must have lived such a good life, it might not be the wrong statement because it's not like you need to be beaten to become a better person. There's no good in beating someone wrongfully. But if you look at verse 6, we can see that this is not how you should raise a child. Considering Adonijah's temperament and personality, it seems unlikely he never did anything worthy of correction, as you can see how arrogant he is. His father must have seen it too, and that's why David chose Solomon to be king. Even though Adonijah was first in line, David must have known from his character and behavior that he was not fit to be king. Why did Adonijah turn out this way? Was David innocent of this result? No. That's why verse 6, the Lord points this out to us. The The phrase rebuked him carries the meaning to scold or correct. It refers to instructing a child when they've done wrong for the sake of proper education. But here it says David never once rebuked Adonijah, not even once corrected or confronted him for his wrong actions. This is not love. Proverbs 13:24 says, he who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him promptly. Not using the rod is in fact hating your child. If you truly love your child, you can't help but use the rod. Adonijah became arrogant because he had never been rebuked. Proverbs 23 verse 13, it says, do not withhold correction from a child. He could have simply said, discipline your child, but it says, do not withhold correction from a child. Especially in the Korean Revised Bible, it's very difficult to understand. But why was it written this way? It places emphasis. It is emphasized. You take it more strongly. Do not withhold correction from a child. For if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. It means to separate the child from many sins. The rod protects the child from many dangers. Because of Adonijah's rebellion, for a brief moment, there were two kings, David and Adonijah. And after Solomon was officially enthroned, once again, two kings existed. Likewise, there are two kings in this world today. The king of this world, the devil, and my king, Jesus. Which side will you stand on? In 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 8, if you look, 1 Kings chapter 1 verse 8, it says, but Zadok the priest, Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, Nathan the prophet, Shimei, Ray, and the mighty men who belonged to David were not with Adonijah. Those who did not align themselves with Adonijah knew very well how powerful the supporting group around him was. It's like the tragic moment in our country's history, December 12th, the military insurrection. Which side you chose determined your faith. In worldly terms, those who aligned themselves correctly ended up becoming generals or even presidents. But those who remained loyal to their duty as soldiers had to take off their uniforms, endure torture, and go to prison. We carry that tragic history. It must have been intense, a matter of life and death. And we just read it as text now. But imagine what the atmosphere must have been like. Danger must have been very high. Yet some remained faithful to the end, saying, I will not side with Abiathar. There's an old saying that goes, loyalty to one's Lord. A loyal subject does not serve two kings. I will remain within the order that God has established until the end. Who am I serving as king? Who is my king? Let's look at chapter 2. Finally, David's last words are recorded. 1 Kings chapter 2 verse 1. Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man. He said to prove yourself a man. What kind of person is a man? David knew. After David's death, Solomon would face many political enemies who would attack and trouble him. And now, Solomon alone would have to take and make major national decisions and judgments. A single misstep could endanger the entire kingdom, and the suffering would fall directly on the people. In a way, he was standing on the edge of a blade. Being a king is a lonely and fearful position. So what is most needed in that moment? To be courageous like a man. First, be bold like a man. Who is a man? A humble person is a man. That's right. When you see people who aren't all that, yet act like they know everything and boast in this world, it's not very appealing. But what about a true man? He's quiet. He's humble. A man is one who forgives. A man has courage. The command to be a man includes all of this. It's not just about being bold. Be humble. Be forgiving. Be a person of courage. And someone who can admit when they are wrong. Saying, I was wrong. That's manly. And someone who knows how to sacrifice for others. In a way, David's last words are also a message to us who are royal priests. We too are descendants of the king who rules over God's kingdom. Right? We govern the church, our homes, and lead our own faith lives according to the truth and will of the Lord. So we can understand David's last words as guidance, not just for Solomon, but also for us about the attitudes and mindsets we must have in life. The lessons that Solomon needed in order to lead Israel well and keep the nation at peace are the same principles we need to keep the church and our homes and our personal faith in peace, and to make sure that we are properly directed towards God. We must be a man. And secondly, it says to obey the word. Let's look at verse 3. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. The command was to obey the word. This was the very reason Solomon fell. He had wisdom. He was naturally intelligent. He built the temple and achieved great accomplishments, but he did not obey the word. God had commanded not to take foreign women as wives. The law says a king must not have many wives. But he broke that command and had 1,000 wives. Though he left behind many achievements, he disobeyed the word. He had wisdom, but he neglected the word. That is why Solomon was rejected after building the temple. He neglected the word. He neglected the word. To maintain a spiritually sensitive faith, it cannot be done by human will alone. You must meditate on the word and you must obey it. That's how you keep a sensitive faith. It doesn't happen by our will or effort alone. David experienced this too. Why do you think he left these last words? Because he knew from personal experience he had served the Lord so well, yet failed terribly because of Bathsheba. In order to cover up his adultery, he even committed murder. After experiencing it himself, David was essentially saying, don't live like I did. If you want to avoid such things, obey the word. Only when you obey the word can you flee these trials and dangers. But Solomon neglected the word. Let's look at page 12. Page 12. It's the second paragraph from the top. It says, David had personally experienced these truths in his own life, and that's why he could confidently emphasize them to Solomon. Whether one obeys or disobeys the word determines the success or failure of a life. David's last words weren't just about Solomon's personal success, but also about the fate of the entire nation of Israel. Obey the word. And one more thing, pass that obedience on to the next generation. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 4. That the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. What does it mean when it says, if your sons walk? It means to teach your descendants. Teach your descendants to live a life of obedience to the word. Deuteronomy 6 from verse 6 to 7, it says, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. This is the very reason Israel fell. What was the reason Israel stumbled and was destroyed in the book of Judges? It was lack of education. Lack of education. The cutoff of education. That is why Pyeongtaek Church places such a strong emphasis on and invests in the church school. A generation of obedience and a generation of passion must not be cut off in our time. It must be passed down again and again and again. The fourth point in David's last words was to be absolute in upholding justice. He wasn't saying to take personal revenge. Israel was a theocratic nation, and the king served as God's representative. Because the king had a duty to uphold the law and execute it, David instructed Solomon to judge those who had rebelled and defied the king. He told him to punish Joab and to punish Shimei. What lesson does this teach us on page 13? The third paragraph from the top, it says, Shimei cursed David as he fled from Absalom's rebellion. At that time, David did not put Shimei to death because, having just subdued Absalom's uprising, it was more important to restore the public sentiment. That's why David spared Shimei then. They therefore chose not to provoke an issue that could have stirred up conflict among the tribes. Right, for the sake of unity, it was left alone. Shimei, being from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe as King Saul, remained a potential threat to the Davidic dynasty. In the end, this purge ordered by David was intended to fulfill God's justice and to establish Solomon's royal authority. From this, we can receive the lesson that anything threatening our faith must not be left tolerated. Do not leave anything that endangers your faith unchecked. Just as Joab and Shimei were condemned, we are being told that anything posing a threat to our faith must be cut off and removed. Furthermore, the judgment of Shimei and Joab teaches us another important lesson. Our lives are not buried in the past. We are inevitably evaluated based on how we have lived. This shows us that we shall surely be evaluated. Now, let's look at page 14. In number 5, it says, show kindness to the good. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 7, it says, show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite. When David was fleeing from Absalom, Barzillai helped him. David could never forget the kindness Barzillai showed during the time of his great hardship and misery. Therefore, he instructs that grace be returned to Barzillai's children. In matters of injustice, there must be thorough punishment, and in cases of good, there must be clear reward. This is the establishment of God's justice. That's why in Revelation chapter 22, verse 12, it says, and behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to give to everyone according to his work. The same applies to us. How we serve the Lord. When our brothers and sisters were struggling, were we like Barzillai, offering help? When the church was truly in hardship, did we stand with the church in its suffering? Or did we quietly withdraw, choosing instead to live comfortably, doing what we wanted, enjoying what we please? God knows. It means that he will repay exactly according to what each has done. And we can see that God appoints acceptable workers. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 35. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 35. The king put Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, in his place over the army, and the king put Zadok, the priest, in the place of Abiathar. God appoints acceptable workers in place of those removed. Likewise, in Leviticus 14:42, it says that if there's a leprous contamination in the stones of a house, the stones are to be removed and replaced with others. What is the lesson for us? If I'm not acceptable, God will raise another worker in my place. God appointed King David in place of King Saul, and Matthias in place of Judas Iscariot. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 27, Apostle Paul testifies, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I preach to others, I myself should become disqualified." Even Apostle Paul constantly disciplined his flesh and brought it into submission. Why? Because even after having served the Lord all his life, if he failed to bring his flesh into subjection and ended up living his life in sin at the end, the Lord might say, "You've come this far, but no more. You are no longer fit to be an apostle. I will no longer use you." Being disqualified doesn't mean going to hell. It means that God will no longer use that person. Therefore, we must humble ourselves to the end and discipline our flesh into subjection. Solomon, who received David's last words, he started off well. In chapter 3, let's look at chapter 3. He asked for wisdom. He didn't ask for wealth or health or material things. What did he ask for? He asked for wisdom. However, look at verse 1. Chapter 3, verse 1. Even though Solomon asked for wisdom, the darkness began to take root from this point. Verse 1. Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. He entered into a Gentile marriage. Of course, the law, specifically Deuteronomy chapter 21, does permit taking a converted Gentile woman. However, what he did here was not that. He took the Egyptian princess as his wife for the sake of a political alliance. And what happened because of this? He took wife after wife. And how many did he end up with? 1,000. Just like a small cancerous tumor grows and grows until it takes a person's life, or like a small crack in a dam expands until the whole dam collapses, or like a tiny hole in the bottom of a ship enlarges until the ship sinks, Solomon's small sin began to take root from this point. Now let's look at verse 5. Verse 5. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask, what shall I give you?" This is a statement that only God can make. What shall I give you? It's a question only someone who possesses everything can ask. Only the one who can give anything can say such a thing. What shall I give you? What will you ask from God? A prominent nose? What shall I give you? Big eyes? But Solomon, in verse 9, asked for wisdom. He asked for wisdom. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for wisdom is an inclining heart. It's amusing, right? Wisdom means an inclining heart, a listening heart. This is wisdom. So what is true wisdom? It is to listen to the word well. True wisdom is discerning the will of God. That's what real wisdom is. Solomon had great wisdom. God had given it to him, but he did not listen to the word. That's why he was corrupted. Jesus is wisdom, right? Look at page 16, the second paragraph. In 1 Corinthians 1:24, it says, Christ is the wisdom of God. Solomon had much wisdom, but Jesus was wisdom itself. So through Solomon, we can catch a glimpse of Jesus, but we can also realize our need for him. No matter how intelligent a king may be, he can never be perfect or complete. Only Jesus can be our perfect king. As a result, let's look at page 17 in chapter 4. In page 17, it says in chapter 4, Solomon enjoys glory and Israel experiences prosperity. This describes the blessings that wisdom brings. The nation prospers, and this can be seen as a picture of the church growing and becoming stable. How did the nation become stable? How can the church flourish and be secure? By appointing the right workers at the right time. Verses 1 through 6 shows this, and in verse 2, we can see that Solomon entrusted key roles to the descendants of important figures from David's era. They likely learned from their parents' expertise. Also, Solomon appointed workers who brought harmony between the old and the new. In any case, the most crucial factor in a nation's prosperity is appointing good workers. Likewise, the best condition for a church to grow and remain stable is the raising up of good workers. That's why we have this academy. That's why we have Gideon School. When the word is taught, good workers naturally begin to form. You can tell by how someone treats the word, how they regard the church, and how they interact with saints that they would make a great worker for the church. If you become a worker, the church will become stable and continue to grow. And in chapter 4, we see the blessings that wisdom brought. The population increased, verse 20. The nation became joyful, verse 20. It became stable and peaceful, verse 25. Prosperous, verses 22 to 23. And gained fame, verses 29 to 34. Looking at Solomon, we can understand how important one person can be. If a nation meets the right king, it prospers. If it meets the wrong king, it falls. When the king is good, the people are happy. Right? In the same way, we must become Christians who have a positive influence. Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 34. Let's read together. And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. All the kings of the earth came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. That was his influence. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we too could lead many to salvation through the wisdom of God? Those who receive salvation first must understand that they carry influence. What do those who came later do? They look to those who were saved earlier and follow them. That's why we must have a healthy faith and a sound view of the church. If you meet someone with the wrong thoughts and faith, you will end up with a misguided faith. So what about me? Do I have a healthy and sound view of faith, the church, and salvation? in chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8, we see that Solomon received grace from God. In chapter 3, Solomon asked for wisdom. And in chapter 4, we can see he began to enjoy the blessings that resulted from that wisdom. Then to repay the grace he had received, he began building the temple in chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Our life of faith is about serving the Lord because of the grace we received out of gratitude. That's what the construction of the temple in chapters 5 through 8 represents. Now let's turn back to page 6. After the temple was built, in chapter 11, Solomon falls into corruption. My apologies. Let's now turn to page 20. Let's go to page 20. In chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba comes to visit Solomon. Let's look at chapter 10, verse 1. Now, when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Everyone lives with hard questions, problems that can't be solved by philosophy, science, or even great politicians. But when the Queen of Sheba met Solomon, those hard questions were resolved. This shows that only by meeting Jesus, who is wisdom itself, can all of life's problems truly be solved. Remarkably, the Queen of Sheba made the right choice. How long did she travel to hear Solomon's wisdom? 1,500 kilometers from Ethiopia to Jerusalem. And as a result, even the descendants of the Queen of Sheba came to believe in God. In Acts chapter 8, verse 27, we see a man from Ethiopia, a eunuch in charge of the treasury under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, traveling to Jerusalem. Why? Because he had a faith in God that had been passed down from the time of the Queen of Sheba. Amazing, isn't it? This shows the power of one person's influence. And distance wasn't an issue. To hear wisdom and resolve her questions, she traveled 1,500 kilometers. That wasn't a problem. If only she could hear the truth, no suffering or sacrifice was too great. And in the end, the problem was solved. She met with Solomon. Those who seek and ask, God gives it to them. And in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 3, as shown on page 21, in 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 3 on page 21, it says that Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing too difficult for him to explain. Clearly, the Queen of Sheba must have brought very challenging questions that even the most brilliant scholars in all of Ethiopia couldn't answer. Yet Solomon answered all of them. The Bible contains all the answers, doesn't it? The Lord gives all the answers. So don't wander. And don't try to solve your problems outside the church or from apart from the Lord. Come to the Lord. That's where things are resolved. Family problems, workplace problems, marriage problems, personal problems, all are resolved in the Lord. So don't try to solve them by any other means. 1 Kings 10, verse 5. 1 Kings 10, 5. The food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. She saw these things and there was no more spirit in her. There was no more spirit in her. In the same way, when we enter heaven and meet the Lord, we will marvel. When we hear the Lord's words, we too will be amazed. When we enter into his kingdom, how astonished will we be? If there was no more spirit in the Queen of Sheba just by seeing the entryway Solomon used to go up to the house of the Lord, how much more astonished will we be when we meet the Lord face to face in heaven. In verse 5, it mentions the service of the waiters. Do you know what this means? It's referring to how the waiters would all be lined up at the entryway, ready to serve. And every time the king gave a command, they moved swiftly and orderly. Seeing that amazed her. It also says that she was astonished by their apparel and the cupbearers. She was amazed at how many trustworthy, loyal servants the king had. She realized, like king, like servant. That's what amazed her. What shocked her wasn't just the size of the palace. It was the amount of good workers there were. When the king spoke, they responded instantly and in perfect coordination. That's what left her in awe. Isn't this a picture of our church? People are amazed when they visit the summer retreat, aren't they? What surprises them? Just seeing people lining up quietly for meals amazes them, right? In the world, that kind of order is unheard of. 10,000 people gather and not a single word of cursing is heard. No trash lying around. That amazes them, right? They're amazed seeing that. They're astonished when they see our church. They see our brothers and sisters smiling. They see their warm greetings. They see their constant laughter and friendliness. That's what amazes them. There's something clearly different about those who serve Jesus Christ as King. That's why Gentiles are amazed when they see us. They're astonished to see brothers sitting and testifying for 2 hours. How can these men talk for 2 hours sober without any alcohol? They're amazed. When they see brothers gathering together, they're surprised because Gentile men can't seem to talk without alcohol. They rely on being drunk to open up. But the brothers, they talk for 2 hours without a single drop of alcohol. That amazes them. They're different. We are different. Those who serve the Lord as King are different. Now let's get verse 8. This is how they see us. Happy are your men and happy are your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom. The Queen of Sheba, who came from Ethiopia, said, happy are your servants who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. An outsider recognized how blessed they were. But do you think Solomon's own servants, who were always under him, realized how blessed they were? What is true happiness? It is being able to hear Solomon's wisdom, to have fellowship with Solomon. That is true blessing. And we have someone greater than Solomon among us. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. Matthew chapter 12, verse 42. Let's read together. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. If the people thought, how blessed is it to have fellowship with Solomon, to hear his wisdom, then how much more blessed are those who hear the teachings of Jesus and have fellowship with him, someone who's greater than Solomon. Solomon was wise, but Jesus is wisdom itself. Solomon had a broad heart, but Jesus prayed a prayer of forgiveness from the cross. Solomon was a walking encyclopedia, but Jesus possesses boundless wisdom. Solomon ruled over Israel, but Jesus rules over the entire universe. Solomon was the king of Israel, but Jesus is the King of Kings. He is far greater than Solomon. How truly blessed we are to hear his words, to have fellowship with him. How truly happy we are. Salvation itself is happiness. Being able to come to this academy and hear the word together, that's happiness. Serving within the church, the body of the Lord, that's happiness. Being able to have fellowship with one another, that's true happiness. Being able to draw near to God, that is genuine happiness. Do you recognize this as happiness? This is happiness and grace. And yet, the saying goes, you were overjoyed. They overjoyed it in chapter 11. Solomon is corrupted. It becomes a chapter of sorrow. In chapter 11, Solomon falls into corruption. If Solomon, who had unprecedented wisdom, still fell, how much more should we cling to the Lord? That wise King Solomon eventually stumbled. So how much more carefully should we serve the Lord? Let's look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4. Verse 4. So it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods. The devil is remarkable. He waited beside Solomon. How long did he wait? Until Solomon grew old. He waited thinking, just grow old, Solomon, then I'll make you fall. It's remarkable. One thing we can learn from the devil is his persistence, that unyielding persistence. It's something we should learn from. And what we need to be especially cautious of this, when we grow older, we need to be more careful. Faith can grow old. As our faith ages, it becomes dull. That's what aging means, losing sensitivity. The longer we've been in the faith, the longer we serve, the more we lose our fear. We stop praying and begin to serve based on past experience. This is a sign that our faith is aging. Solomon changed gradually. It didn't happen overnight. He added one wife, then two, then three, until it reached 1,000. More and more. Even if it was 900, he should have stopped there, right? I mean, think about it, 900? But he went all the way to 1,000. He fell. And he kept falling more and more. He didn't serve idols all at once. His heart gradually turned away from God little by little, until eventually it was directed towards idols. Little by little, he changed. Over time, he began to forget David's last words. Those last words faded from his memory little by little. Even a wise king fell in a moment. We too must remember, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. Are you truly doing well? Are you truly doing well in your faith? Let's turn to page 6. Page 6. In the second paragraph, we see the depiction of the divided kingdom spanning from chapters 12 to 22, a period of 86 years. During this time, 4 kings ruled in southern Judah and 8 kings ruled in northern Israel. In the south, the first king was Rehoboam. He was the first king, and followed by Abijam as the second, Asa as the third, and Jehoshaphat as the fourth. In the north, there are 8 kings, beginning in chapter 14, and the first king was Jeroboam. Chapter 15, we see the second king was Nadab, and then Baasha. And in chapter 16, we are introduced to Elah, followed by Zimri, Omri, and Ahab, who was the 7th king of northern Israel. And finally, in chapter 22, we see the 8th king, Ahaziah. But it's important that we pay special attention to chapter 13. In this chapter, a prophet from Judah appears. However, this prophet disobeys God's command. Rather than following the path God had instructed, he is deceived by the false words of the prophet from Bethel and takes another route, which leads to his death. Why is this written in chapter 13 of 1 Kings? There's a reason. If even a prophet of God died for disobedience, then What about the rest of us? There are two meanings here. First, God's word will certainly be fulfilled. Second, disobedience always leads to judgment. This is given as a continual warning. That is why the death of the prophet from Judah is recorded in chapter 13. Then, in chapter 17, Elijah appears. Although this is a record of the kings, the prophet Elijah's story spans 3 chapters. Why? During the reign of the most corrupt king Ahab, God sends the greatest prophet Elijah. In this dark time, God shines his light, demonstrating his love and grace all the way through. That's why even in the record of the kings, Elijah appears. Then in chapter 21, we see the well-known incident of Naboth's vineyard being seized. Why was this event recorded? It serves as a prime example of unending human greed. A king already possesses so much, yet he still took the vineyard. This represents unending human greed. What about us? Are we truly content? Or do you still feel like something is missing? Do you want that vineyard? Then someone must die. That's the nature of our human greed, to kill and take what we desire. Isn't this an image of sacrificing our faith to satisfy our cravings, to disobey, to fill ourselves with the things of the world? Isn't that what it means to grieve the Lord in order to satisfy our greed? Then, in chapter 22, Ahab dies. Amazingly, by an arrow shot at random. Ahab tries to be clever. He told King Jehoshaphat to wear royal robes into battle while he disguised himself as a regular soldier, all to save his own life. But ironically, he was struck by a random arrow and died. What does this show? God's judgment is certain. It's inescapable. It shows that God's judgment cannot be escaped. Let's turn to page 23. Page 23. Page 23. We'll conclude by looking at the event of Israel splitting into northern Israel and southern Judah. Why did Israel divide into northern Israel and southern Judah? The cause was a wrong encounter. A wrong encounter. Rehoboam rejected the counsel of the elders. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 13, he disregarded the advice of the elders. And in verse 14, it says he followed the advice of the young men. This carries 2 important meanings. He only listened to what he wanted to hear. He listened to those who spoke pleasing words to him and ignored words that were uncomfortable to hear. And that leads to ruin. He surrounded himself with peers, those who were comfortable to be around, those who were like him. But Proverbs 13:20 says, he who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools will be destroyed. It's unfortunate, isn't it? The division of the nation was caused by wrong encounters. That's why whom you associate with is so important. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11 says, do not keep company with anyone named a brother who is a drunkard or an extortioner. It says, don't keep company with those who call themselves a brother but are secretly in sin. There are people like that. Those who, not wanting to go alone, bring other brothers and sisters with them to inappropriate places. They justify their sins. And they scheme to rationalize their sins. Don't associate with such people. On page 24, it says that light and darkness cannot have fellowship. And don't associate with those who do not obey. And avoid those who talk too much gossip, talk ill of others. That is based on Proverbs chapter 20, verse 19. Also in verses 22 to 24, we are told not to associate with those who cannot forgive their brothers and hold on to their anger. Avoid people who are always upset with the church and blame others. Proverbs 23, verse 20 says, do not mix with wine bibbers or with gluttonous eaters of meat. You might think, oh, but I really like pork belly. It's not saying not to associate with those who like pork belly. It's talking about those who are fleshly. Avoid those who use their money in the wrong ways, who spend their resources to satisfy fleshly desires. Don't associate with such people. They don't hesitate to spend on food, but they're stingy with offerings. They don't mind spending to decorate their flesh, but they hesitate to show hospitality to brothers and sisters. They spend freely on their own families, but they've never once opened their home to brothers and sisters. Don't associate with such people. There's nothing to learn from them. If you do this as well, then you'll become fleshly yourself. This is exactly why the nation was torn in two. What causes our faith to be divided? Wrong relationships. What robs us of joy? Wrong relationships. What breaks our passion? Wrong relationships. You must choose your relationships wisely. You must meet good people. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 25, we see that after Jeroboam became king, he built Shechem and Penuel. After becoming king, what did he do? He strengthened his rule by building fortified cities and reinforcing strategic military locations. But the problem was he did not establish his own hearts. Jeroboam built strong cities and walls, but he did not build up his own faith. And in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 28 to 33, we see that he set up golden calves in Bethel and Dan, appointed ordinary people as priests, changed the feast of the Lord, the Feast of Tabernacles, from the 15th day of the 7th month to the 15th day of the 8th month. And verse 33 says, he did what he devised in his own heart. Jeroboam built Shechem and Penuel, but he failed to build his own faith. God had clearly prophesied that he would become king. So he should have trusted and obeyed God's word. But he was afraid. He feared that if the people went to Jerusalem to separate the Feast of Tabernacles, they would not return. So he said, don't go. And made golden calves in Bethel and Dan, declaring, these are the gods who brought us out of Egypt. He repeated exactly the mistakes his ancestors had made. This shows us we have to be careful, because if we do wrong, our children will learn from us. They'll make a golden calf. If I make a golden calf, then my children will also make a golden calf. If I leave, my children will leave. Not only that, but in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 32, it says he made it similar to what existed. No matter how similar it looks, if it's only similar, it's fake. Even if it's 99% the same, it's still fake. Even if it's 99.9% similar, it's still fake. Only what's according to the Bible is real. Anything apart from the Bible is not real. I'm sorry to say this, but real faith is not impersonation. You may come on the Lord's Day, but you skip district fellowship. You attend on Wednesday, but you avoid sisters fellowship. You only live your faith life in the boundaries or limitations which have been said. You don't open your home, nor do you accept visitation. That's just impersonation. I'm sorry to say this, but no matter how similar it may be, it's not real. The Christian life isn't about similar impersonation. It's about living according to the word. We must not treat our faith like counterfeit. It must be genuine, authentic. That's the message here. This was the cause of the division between the northern and southern kingdoms. Wrong relationships and impersonated and similar faith. Take heed of that. Finally, let's turn to Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. We'll read and we'll end. Today, though we studied the book of 1 Kings, we begin and end with another book. Let's read Matthew chapter 2, verse 2. Let's read together. Saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. He is not only the King of the Jews. He is my King who has come to this earth. He is Jesus Christ. Worship him alone. He alone can perfectly lead us into God's kingdom and into truth. He is the king who truly loves his people, who has the power to protect them, who is wisdom itself. He is the king who can resolve every problem in my life. Worship him.